I'm so excited about it because I love the additional positive impact that we can have to reach the goals that we have for our lives, because trauma steals from us. And it's another method to regain some of what's been taken. Welcome to Reclamation, everyone, a Be Emboldened initiative. I'm Naomi. I'm the founder and executive director here at BE, and we exist for those impacted by spiritual abuse. We provide support for the prevention of victimization and re-victimization. We do this by creating a safe place to ask the hard questions and to begin healing and rebuilding. Today, I have a very interesting topic for y'all, and I'm excited about it because I have some personal history that I'll circle back to in a second. But first, I want to introduce our special guest, Alexandra Roark. And Alexandra, I'm going to hand it to you. Would you mind sharing with people some of your credentialing? And I know you're working on a PhD, and kind of give us some of that background and kind of why you're here, how you came to be here.
Yes, I would love to. I'm so excited to be here and talk about something that I'm very passionate about. I started off getting my undergrad in psychology. I did an internship with Dr. Ron Swatsiana, who I'll talk about today, and that's where the passion started. So I went back and I got my master's in social work at UT Austin. And now I work at Houston Neuroscience Brain Center, and I have a nonprofit called Desert Road Ministries, which I'm really proud of. Where Desert Road Ministries, we offer mental health services, burnout prevention, and neurofeedback to ministry leaders and their families, church volunteers. At the Brain Center, we do EEGs that can look for neurological causes for symptoms. And we provide neurofeedback therapy and photobiomodulation services to as a treatment modality, as well as talk therapy. And I am an applied psychophysiology program, PhD program at Saybrook University, where we are learning about the mind and body connection and using a well-rounded approach to treatment instead of like a biomedical model.
It's so exciting. And okay, so I have a couple of points that I want to hit on before I start asking all of the questions that I have for you today. And they come from different conversations that I've had with our audience, as well as some of the concerns that I hear from some people who maybe aren't even a part of our audience, but, know about the work that is being done and maybe have some background that they bring to the table, with their perspective. And so first, I want to address that sometimes there is a concern I've heard from people who are worried about kind of getting into some areas with clinical stuff where they're like, I don't really understand what this is. And there can be some fear that comes from that, right? When we don't really understand the science of what it is. And even the idea of science can be scary depending on what background, religious background, maybe someone has come out of. And so if they've come from something that maybe is more like fundamentalist, depending, I'm using that broadly, or like my cult background for sure, like anything where it's like, this is scientifically based, like that actually would have been a negative for us. Like that would have actually turned us away. And so I wanted to start by just speaking to that and saying that I am going to ask Alexandra to share some of the background about neurofeedback, a little bit about how it works. And I'm hoping that that will help ease any of those concerns of like, well, is this something funky? Is this something like EMDR gets pushed back about maybe having like new age kind of related roots, things like that, where people come across it and they're like, is this something that is safe? Is this something that would fall into my Christian worldview? And so again, we're going to get into some of that background so that hopefully you would feel confident in checking this out if you think it would be a good modality for you. The other comment I want to make before we jump in is that I personally had neurofeedback for a TBI. So I had a traumatic brain injury back in 2016. It was really serious. I had quite a bit of head trauma growing up. And so this was considered like a re-injury. And so my body responded in a way that maybe someone else would not have had they not had that previous head trauma. I had a very significant head trauma when I was 8, where I was unconscious for like 18 hours. And so different things where it was like, it was serious. And so to have a head trauma then as an adult really impacted me. So the result of this TBI, it was lasting a really long time, and I wasn't getting anywhere just with brain rest and all of those things. And I lost my ability to comprehend what I was reading. And I was in a master's program at Denver Seminary at the time. I was slurring my speech. I was sleeping about 20 hours a day. And so I found someone who worked on NFL football players who had lots of brain trauma, right? And fortunately got connected with her and started receiving neurofeedback. And I credit that with getting my brain back. So I'm like 98% to what I was before. There's a couple things where I notice when my brain gets tired. Any clients who have me at the end of the day, they might notice that I'll trip up on words a little bit, or the wrong word will kind of come out, or it'll like sort of not totally be a word and I'll have to say it again. And so I still have these like little minor, like kind of like quirks from it, but pretty much back to normal. And so I've experienced neurofeedback in that regard. And because it was so incredibly impactful and so healing for my brain and my body, I have been very excited about its use for people who have experienced trauma. I can see where it would be so helpful. And it's something that I'm looking at getting certified in myself. I highly encourage that people look into it more, get their questions answered, and again, consider it as one of the modalities that are available to them. Definitely not the only one. I do plan to have guests on to talk about other modalities too. Alexandra and I just happened to connect at a conference over the summer. And so I wanted to bring her in and be like, oh my gosh, this is great. Like, I would love for you to share about it. Totally lots of options out there, but this is something again that me personally, like I'm really excited about. So I'm happy to bring you on as my first guest for what I'm going to consider to kind of be a series to talk about some of these different approaches. So with that, Alexandra, I will finally get you talking. Will you give us an overview of like, let's start with just what is neurofeedback? What are we even saying? And then we'll kind of break down maybe a brief history, how it works, what a session looks like, things like that.
Yes. So neurofeedback training, a technical word for it could be operant conditioning. And so basically what that term means is that you are giving the brain a reward when it's doing what we want it to do. And then you take away that reward when it's not doing what we want it to do. And that in itself trains the brain to perform the frequencies that are most optimal, that leave the person being the best version of themselves.
Excellent. And where did this kind of come from? So how did this come to be?
Yes. So EEGs were established in 1924 by Hans Berger. And so that was the start of the EEG. And then in the late 50s, early 60s, neurofeedback was started because Dr. Joe Kamiya, he found out that you could increase someone's alpha, like a human's alpha wave, by giving them a reward. And then, who was it? Dr. Barry Sturman, he learned through cats. He would use his wife's cats and put the EEG recording in their brains. And he found that he could uptrain their SMR waves by giving them milk, which then led him to realize that it made them more resistant to seizure activity in the next study that he did. And so that helped contribute to the neurofeedback research that they do today to help prevent seizures and help with epilepsy. And so that was the beginning. And it's just, been growing and improving since then. And here we are today. But yeah, it's such an interesting beginning, thinking of someone, doing tests on their wives' cats before the IRBs came along and put more guidelines into animal research.
Yes. Well, and I also want to break that down a little bit for people in case they're like, they put what in the cat's brain? Will you describe so you can describe it in relation to the cats or in relation to if I came into your office, what does this actually look like?
Yeah, I'll use the human since that's more relative. So what we do, I wish I had a cap nearby, but it's just a fab elastic, a cap that we put on. And then there's these little kind of little mini cups in 19 sites. And so what we do is we fill those sites up with gel. So it's not invasive at all. It's all just, we're trying to get gel on top of the scalp so that we can read the electrical activity that's going on within the brain. And then we put ear clips on the person. There's like a whole like little trio you have to do in order to read electrical activity. You have to have an active, a reference, and a ground. And so the ear clips are a ground because there's no electricity in your ear. And then we're able to read the electrical activity, and that's how we're able to train the brain. So relating the EEG to neurofeedback. So it's like a 2-computer system. So we have, I guess I'll get into like our neurofeedback process too.
Yeah, go for it.
Here at the center to help explain. So a client, we'll put the cap on them. And when we're doing the neurofeedback training, we have it set up where we're reading a part of the brain. So like for me, when I did neurofeedback on myself, I was doing CZ. So we'd put some gel right here. The system was reading the brain waves, and the system could tell what frequencies the brain was operating at. And our clients, the reward that we use is a TV show or a movie. So we have like Netflix, Disney Plus, and the system is reading their brain. And when their brain is in the frequency range that we want it to be in, the screen is bright and the sound is on. But then whenever the brain isn't operating how we want, the screen dims and the volume goes away. And it's just absolutely wild, but amazing that the brain can pick up onto this. Our brain is just so intelligent. It's just amazing how God made us this way, you know, that our brain picks up on, okay, I have control over this screen. And I'm starting to notice that whenever I'm in this frequency range, I can see this movie that I want to see. And it's annoying whenever it goes away. So I'm going to keep producing this so I can keep seeing the movie.
It's really incredible. Yeah. And something else that's really neat about it, everyone, is that there's nothing that like I was supposed to be doing. It's not like I have to think about something or I have to like, and I'm curious though, like if someone is seeing you because of a trauma that they've experienced, is there anything about that that's different? Now, when I was coming in for a TBI, it was like, no, I'm just sitting here and my brain in the machine is just doing what it does. And then afterwards I go home.
Yes. So I love that you bring up that point, because that is the most common question I get from my neurofeedback clients is like, what am I supposed to be doing? Like, how do I help this? And I basically just tell them, all you need to do is, you know, focus on the movie. Don't try to daydream, and then just focus on relaxing your body. You know, focus on your breathing and just your body feeling like heavy in your chair. And as long as you're relaxed and you're watching, then your brain is going to do the rest of the work for you. As far as like our clients coming in who have experienced trauma, we'd probably just want to do a check in and make sure that the movie or TV show that they watch isn't going to be potentially triggering for them.
Sure.
And there would be some more things in the assessment process that we would look at, as far as looking at adding therapy in addition to the neurofeedback, because you know, I can talk about this more later too, but neurofeedback isn't a standalone treatment. It's helpful in improving the brain, but there's still techniques and modalities that's helpful to learn to help manage those symptoms that come with trauma. And then another thing I wanted to bring up, are you familiar with biofeedback therapy?
Little bit. Yeah.
So it's a really great combination with neurofeedback as well, because what that is it's a similar feedback process where it's giving you feedback, but it's on how your body is operating. So we can hook someone up to look at their muscle tension, their skin temperature, heart rate, respiration rate, and their skin conductance, which is like the sweat in your hands. And it can teach someone to relax their bodies, because they can see whenever their body is tense and when it's not.
And what would you do then with that information?
So, well, for example, I've been doing it this past semester at my school because I'm looking at getting trained. So what I did is you start with a stress test, and it shows you how reactive your body is to stress and how well it recoups. So someone who we think maybe hasn't experienced trauma has a resilient central nervous system. Whenever they experience stress, well, their body is going to just go back to their baseline a few minutes once the stress is gone. But someone who has trauma, or maybe their central nervous system is dysregulated, then after the stress test, even when the stressor goes away, their body's going to be stuck in that hypervigilant state. We see that a lot with clients with trauma. So what the biofeedback does is we'll do a training session. We'll have their body hooked up so we can see their heart rate, their skin temperature. I was focusing on skin temperature for mine because my skin temperature is, when I get stressed, my fingers get cold. Like my finger is kind of cold right now since this is exciting. What you can do with the biofeedback is you go and you practice your resonant breathing. You can do, go to like a safe space in your head. You can, do what relaxes you. And then the biofeedback device will give you positive feedback whenever your body is calming down. And you can realize, okay, this is what it feels like to calm down. And then it's just a way to teach you how to control it. So with me, within like 3 sessions, I was able to control my skin temperature and raise my hand temperature to help me get into a calm state. Does that make sense? Am I explaining it?
So interesting. Yeah, I think it does make sense. So really, it's just training your nervous system to be able to respond the way you're wanting it to. So you would notice, oh gosh, I'm feeling this way, and be able. So I'm thinking about this example. Let me know if you're like, no, this doesn't relate at all. But I'm thinking of this example where when I was working with a physical therapist, and it would take me a couple of times, but like it got to the point where like they could tell me where to release a muscle and I could do it. Because it was just that like those neurons were so like fired up and just working so well at that point from like doing this for a little while. But I picked up on it pretty quickly where they could be like, I need you to release your left hip flexor a little bit more. And I could like think about where I needed to release and I could do it. And like, it's, but it's kind of this honed in. It's not like, well, yeah, if you want to like put your foot down, you put your foot down. But when you're trying to like hone into these little spots and make these different minor, like, kind of nuanced movements, it's like you really do have to train your brain to be able to pinpoint and communicate with that part of your body to do that.
Right. That is a really great example of it. Yeah, you were basically doing what we do with biofeedback. You were just having a different form of feedback than seeing it on a screen. Because, biofeedback therapists can do that where they can put a sensor on your muscle and they can tell you, and it'll show when it's tense or not. And then you can practice and figure out, oh, this is what it feels like, and have that mind-body connection to relax that muscle yourself. It's really great. But when we think about the brain and the body with these people who have experienced trauma, so I watched a TED talk from one of my classes. I think it was like Janet Seahorn. She was talking about the hidden wound, meaning that whenever someone experiences trauma, and even physical trauma, like you were saying with traumatic brain injuries, the neural networks and the sensory pathways are rewired in a way to try to help that person become more safe. So our brain's trying to help us, but what it does is it rewires it, and then you're stuck in this hypervigilant state where our central nervous systems are constantly aroused. And your amygdala, which is a part of your brain that is in control of fear, it is over aroused. It's constantly going, it's constantly on where I call it like the smoke detector of the brain. So it's constantly on because it's trying to keep you safe. But in reality, when you're in that chronic long-term state, then that's when you're going to have blood pressure issues. You're going to have muscle tension. You can get stomach ulcers. There's so many side effects that come from having a hyper-aroused brain and central nervous system. So the biofeedback is a great way to physiologically help in those situations. And then neurofeedback is really helpful in rewiring the brain so that it's more resilient. And I talk about this window of tolerance with my clients. So everyone has a window of tolerance of how much they can tolerate before they get triggered or before their bodies get to that dysregulated state. And with neurofeedback, what it does is it increases your window of tolerance where you can tolerate more. You have more emotional resiliency before you're going to kind of like your brain flips that switch. Because and what I mean by the flip the switch is whenever we're triggered. So we have the amygdala that I was just talking about, which is the emotional part of the brain, control of fear. Well, we have a prefrontal cortex that's critical thinking. And so whenever we're calm, relaxed, our critical thinking brain is working, and we can weigh the pros and cons and use logic. But then when we flip our switch, our amygdala takes over, our prefrontal cortex turns off, and then we're just ruled by emotional, animal-like instincts.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's absolutely a time and a place for that. Like, so I'm glad that we have that ability where it's like, now is not the time to sit here and weigh the pros and cons. Now is the time to get out. Okay. So yes, like it's purposeful that we have that design. And yet it can become maladaptive, which I think is what you're speaking to, where I'm thinking about, for example, like if I were in a triggered state and say something was triggered, but then my body, having experienced trauma, say it's going to remain in that, that heightened state for an extended, that kind of hyper vigilant functioning over the course of the next several days, especially as all those hormones, chemicals are needing to filter out. And so that's when like my husband coming into the room will make me jump. Whereas typically it wouldn't. Why? Well, because I'm just like up, it's just like, oh my, I'm just really jumpy. And so I'm really quick to respond. And well, I wouldn't need to do that though. So that's then another burst of like adrenaline and that I didn't actually need. And now that's got to filter out of my system and that's tiring, right? And so like my capacity is actually getting lowered. And then I notice, okay, finally when I come down, I usually get sick because I'm crashing, my system's crashing. And so I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, in those situations, I think about the fatigue and what you were talking about earlier, how, by the end of the day, like you notice like you're more tired, you have more word slippage, but before you did the neurofeedback, it was much quicker. I really related to that experience as well, because whenever I went into my neurofeedback experience, I really had no clue what to expect. I was still new into it. And I was like, just doing it because that's one of the factors you need to do in order to get your certificate. You have to do 10 sessions on yourself. And so what I noticed one day, it just hit me. It was probably about 20 sessions in that I remember seeing the clock. It was this clock right over here, and it was 5 or 6 p.m. And I still had energy. And I was like, what? This is insane. This is so unlike me. Usually I was crashing by 12 and I was needing caffeine to get me through the rest of the day. And I was dragging my feet, and all of a sudden I had energy, and it's still, past 12. And then it happened the next day and the next day. And it finally clicked for me. I was like, wow, neurofeedback was able to increase my window of tolerance. And because of my past, I believe that I did have a over-aroused amygdala. And what it does is it just regulates your brain activity where you can tolerate more. I mean, if you think about whenever you're in that fight or flight state, that hyperactive state, it uses so much of your energy. And your brain is one of the biggest energy hogs out there, where it uses most of your energy. So if your brain is constantly trying to look for danger, if your amygdala is constantly always on, that's going to take so much energy from you, and you are going to be exhausted. If you have a brain injury, you are going to be exhausted because, Dr. On says that with brain injury, your brain actually does shut down parts of your brain in order to protect itself, because it doesn't need to use energy for your day-to-day tasks. It needs all of its energy to repair your brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point. It's so interesting. So I want to back up and explain a couple of things for people on kind of the technical side. So what an EEG is, and then when you were talking about like the alpha, and that's so kind of like the different brain waves and what they mean. Would you mind kind of giving people a little detail on those?
Yeah. So we look at different brain waves in the EEG. Specifically to our center, we have a team of neurologists who will read the EEG and can look for underlying causes just based off of reading all the squiggly lines. But we also convert that EEG recording into brain maps where it can show us the dominant frequencies, which would be theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. And so theta is and delta. So delta is your slowest waves, experience it more when you're asleep. Theta, that's more your like daydreamy waves. Alpha is your like resting state, resting / relaxation. Beta is whenever you get more into your like critical thinking, and then gamma is the highest one when you're in your highest performing state. And so all of these are beneficial different during times. And so depending on where you are at in the day, you'll want one to be more dominant. And so what we notice with clients with trauma, ADHD, they may have more excessive theta waves, which can help. How do I say this? So for example, people who fight in combat, whenever you're out there on the field, there's so much going on around you, right? And it can be very overstimulating. So what your brain does is like a protection method is it's going to increase more theta waves so it can help everything become less stimulating. But then when you come back to society, that's not helpful because it impacts your thinking, critical thinking. And then we also see this with people who have ADHD, like big, like video gamers, because that's very overstimulating. So their brains will create more theta waves that will help them be able to tolerate all the stuff that's going on the screen. But then whenever they go to class, it's really hard for them to concentrate on a teacher because there's not that much stimulation. And then they're just going to go off into like daydream, like la la land.
That is fascinating. And so basically, neurofeedback starts to reward like decreases and increases to encourage the brain to sort of, I don't know, balance things out. Does that make sense? Or
Yes. Great way of saying that. Like for example, with these cases, with the excess of theta, what we would do, like we downtrain the theta so that the brain doesn't produce as much theta. And then that's going to help with those ADHD like symptoms, with the trauma symptoms. There's a lot of neurobiomarkers that we look for in EEG. There are isolated epileptiform discharges that we look for, which those can actually only be seen in the raw EEG, which is all those squiggly lines, not the brain maps. And those are really critical to look for because those are discharges, like when one neuron is trying to talk to the other and there's a disconnection. So there can be a lot of behavioral issues that'll happen with those because it's not quite yet seizure-like activity, but it's just enough to cause disconnection and day-to-day functioning. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But then another one that we look for in the raw EEG that you can't see in brain maps are beta spindles. And these are related to ADHD, trauma, physical trauma. And this is something that we can use neurofeedback to get rid of those. And then we're also looking at red light therapy, photobiomodulation for the brain to reduce those as well, because Dr. Ron believes that the beta spindles are connected to neuroinflammation. And so that's why Dr. Ron Swatsiana, he's my mentor. Y'all should definitely check him out. He has a ton of research, a ton of great papers, and I really appreciate his guidance in this. But he really tries to emphasize in the neurofeedback and EEG field the importance of looking at the raw EEG. For those people who are looking for neurofeedback practitioners, make sure you're going to someone who is looking at the brain, because there are some people who would just do neurofeedback based on people's symptoms. We need to look at the brain to know what we're treating, to make sure that these protocols are appropriate for people. And then while the brain maps are very important, if you don't have someone who's not looking at the raw EEG, then there are important neurobiomarkers that you could miss, like the beta spindles and the isolated epileptiform discharges, and then encephalopathy as well. I mean, Dr. Ron, he's a pro at like looking at an EEG and saying like, oh, there's something organic going on here that he wouldn't be able to see in just brain maps. And that'll bring me to my next point of why our team of neurologists do things so different compared to what a neurologist does at a hospital. So if someone goes to a neurologist at a hospital, they're basically going to just be looking at the EEG and checking for tumors or for epilepsy. And then they might see beta spindles and stuff like that, but with their education background, they're just like, oh, well, that's just normal. We see that in a lot of people. But our team of neurologists in this like neurofeedback EEG field, they are trained to specialize looking into the EEG deeper, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're looking for something else. So sort of like I was working with a neurologist, even for the, the physical trauma of a TBI.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like, I mean, we're 4 or 5 months in, it's just like rest. There just wasn't anything versus, okay, I go and I see someone and I get the EEG and that is read and all of this is being done. And it's like, well, wait, no, like we can see where some of these concerns are coming from. And I can't remember what they were. I know I had one that was like right here, but like a hot spot. And so do you guys use that language too of like these hot spots? So yeah, they show up, in red on the brain map portion.
Yeah. So yeah, red would be like there was something excessive going on. So I wonder if you did have excessive of theta, maybe. I don't know. Maybe or beta.
Yeah. But basically it's like, so the team is able to tell this is, again, when we experience trauma, it changes us. Like there's a physiological change that happens. And so, yes, we can do talk therapy, we can do other things. And yet to be able to have some science like this that can really target the physiological changes that have happened alongside having someone, not only companioning with us, but someone who's educated, someone who's, licensed to be able to help with the conversational part of the processing and the tools for when you go home and all of these important conversations that, both of us have with people. It's just an amazing combination. And so I think that's where I'm so excited about it because I love the additional positive impact that we can have to reach the goals that we have for our lives because trauma steals from us. And it's another method to regain some of what's been taken and to do it in a way that it might sound invasive to have like these electrodes stuck in your head, but it's way less invasive than telling someone your story. I mean, I will say that. So,
Yeah.
So to be able to have that is just a really incredible. I just think it's absolutely incredible. And I will say I would be now I went for a TBI though again. So I don't know if there was something different than going for trauma or if just because my brain was so exhausted already, like I was resting a lot. I would go home really tired, but I went home always feeling like very calm and even and level. I'm like, this is a great way to be. Like I would love to feel this way. But I would be really tired. I would go home and have to take a nap.
It is. I tell all my clients, I said, this is more of a brain workout than you realize because your brain is working during these sessions. And so while people, can feel like more relaxed after, tiredness is definitely a normal, if you want to call it side effect or response, because your brain, just like you're tired after you go to the gym, it is a brain workout. And I think it is good to put a focus on like the non-invasive part. Like it's not going to hurt at all. We're not stimulating your brain. We're not, poking you or anything. We're just putting gel on your scalp. The only thing that's going to happen is you're going to walk away with some gel in your hair.
Yeah, you're going to have a bad hair day until you get that out. But yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I had another thought, but I forgot it. It'll come back to me, I'm sure.
So, well, yeah, feel free to just jump back in if it comes back to you so that we don't miss it. But when we're connecting then with someone who's experienced trauma, and you've mentioned how meeting with someone would go hand in hand with them having the neurofeedback protocol. Can you talk a little bit about how that partners?
You mean like the therapy part?
Yes.
Okay, yes. That's actually what I wanted to talk about. So perfect question.
Good.
Okay. So, yes, neurofeedback, I tell my clients is not a standalone treatment. The only time that it would probably be a standalone treatment is when we have people who are coming in for peak performance training. Someone who's just wanting to improve their brains or sports related stuff. But what neurofeedback is doing, it is optimizing your brain. It is regulating your brain. But then there's other tools out there. There's other factors that are important as well. And so with all of our clients, we go back to the basics. And the first thing that we talk about is sleep, nutrition, and movement. All of those are so important when it comes to supporting your brain and supporting your body. So if because if someone is not getting good sleep, if they're just staying on their phone all night, if you're eating, fast food all the time and not moving your body, then neurofeedback's really only going to be able to do a little bit. It's really important to prioritize feeding your body nutrients, getting in protein. So Dr. Ron did a study on a kid. It was 3 days. There was one day that they came in with no breakfast. There was one day they came in with a sugary breakfast. And then the third day they came in and they had a nutritious breakfast focused with protein. The first day that they came in, their brain waves, all of what he saw was related to anxiety symptoms. You're going to be more anxious if you don't have anything in your system. The second day, whenever there was, the sugary breakfast, there was still some signs of the anxiety related waves, but then the ADHD type waves popped up. So that would make sense, right? But then the third day, whenever she came in with a nutritious protein filled breakfast, her EEG was normalized. None of that stuff came up. And so it's just so important. Like, what we feed our bodies does have a huge impact on our brain, and that's how we're going to operate. Sleep is so critical because that's the time when our brain is washing out all of the toxins and, the steps that we need to try to reduce neuroinflammation and have the healing that our brain needs. And then movement, that is just going to build resiliency with your nervous system. If we have a stronger, healthier heart and body, then whenever we are impacted with stress, then our body is going to be able to recoup much quicker. But then beyond the basics, we also like to look at labs. It's very critical to look at labs because sometimes our issues can be fed by something as simple as like a low vitamin D or a thyroid issue or something like that. So we like to roll with that. And then there's the talk therapy part which I feel like talk therapy can relate to what the Bible says, because in the Bible, God talks about, gratitude and not living in fear, not living in anxiety. And, that is helpful, but then it's kind of like, well, how can we get that way? So we can learn tips, tricks, tools to help us live in that state. And so for me and my experience with neurofeedback, I knew a lot of these therapy tools beforehand. I use a cognitive behavioral therapy approach. And so that's reframing our thoughts, questioning our thoughts, asking if there's, validity of facts for what we were thinking. And I knew these things, but it was really hard to apply them based off of how my brain was wired. But what I noticed was after my neurofeedback experience, it was so much easier for me to talk back to negative thoughts and to reframe them into positive ones and have a different way of thinking. Actually, there is a different way to look at that. And it was easier to practice gratitude. It was just like a whole mind shift.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what you're saying reminds me of, this was actually a TikTok video I saw recently for like a therapist who also has a TikTok account. And I appreciate what she puts out, her different snippets and things. And she had said something about how, typically therapists also have therapists. And she's like, it's not because like we could tell ourselves the information, but it's a relationship. And it's not as effective outside of having a relationship. And I'm like, I completely agree with that. And I think that goes back to our design as being relational beings. And so, yeah, I could walk around and just be like, okay, well, what would I say to a client? Well, this is what I would say. It's not the same as like having a conversation with someone. And so there's so much value and another person who, that saying people have probably heard about, like holding space for someone. I'm like, it's about like being there and listening and caring about what's being said, oftentimes more than it is about what's being said back. But therapists can ask really great questions. And so that gets us to think in different ways because they are listening so well and they remember things from when we talked the last time. And so there's just so many benefits, I think, that would be lost even in the neurofeedback process if we didn't also have that relationship going alongside it.
That's so true. I was just with my therapist yesterday and she brought this whole new perspective to a situation where I was like, Wow. I didn't even think about it that way, and it gave me so much peace. It
Mm,
was so helpful.
yeah. Yeah. And so finding that trusted person, who can offer that to you. And of course, if you find that the people are not one and the same, it's not like Alexandra, who you can do the talk therapy with and the neurofeedback with. Oftentimes you can find a team that's willing to talk with one another, and you kind of get this whole team around you, which is also such a gift if someone needs to go that route, whether they're looking at neurofeedback and talk therapy or whatever that looks like. I know there's times where we at Be Emboldened, if someone is having more of a clinical need and we're working outside of, state bounds. And so we're not able to practice in that regard. So it's like, well, we're happy to partner with your therapist in your state to share more about spiritual abuse and help communicate that for you, like what that experience is and some of the nuances of it and things like that. And so we can create more of a team approach for somebody so that they ultimately are getting their needs met.
Yes, I think that is absolutely wonderful. It is so important to find, a therapist that you really click with, like what you were talking about with the relationship. That's what I tell all my clients, it's like it's so important to have that click with your therapist because otherwise then the therapy isn't going to work. So I tell my clients, I'm like, I'm not going to be offended if we don't click. What's important is for you to find someone who you really feel connected with and feel safe with, secure, because therapists, like another benefit to a therapist is they're not going to tell anyone what you're telling them. Like if you're telling a friend, if you're telling a family member, that is helpful. And we do need those people in our lives. But then there might always be like, are they going to go and tell someone? But with the therapist, they are going to sit there with an unbiased, unjudgmental perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, for anyone who's listening and they're kind of wondering, like, gosh, I would like to learn more, and they're wondering if maybe they'd be a candidate for neurofeedback, are there any recommendations or requirements for someone who's considering going in this direction?
So with my centers, how we do things and what I tell people is neurofeedback can help in so many different ways. If you're experiencing anxiety, depression, ADHD, you have a trauma history, physical trauma history. Like I mentioned before, we have people who just come in and they're like, I want to be the best version of myself. Can I do neurofeedback? The first step is always just getting EEG because that's what's going to determine if you're a candidate for neurofeedback or not. We're going to have to look and see, is there any of those neurobiomarkers, like some of the ones I talked about earlier, that we could train. And then what we also do is we want to match what we see in the EEG and the brain maps with clinical symptoms. Because there are some people out there, and we were talking about the hot spots before, where if they see a hot spot, then they just want to train it. But the thing is that if someone isn't, like, let's say someone sees a hot spot at T5, which is your language and reading comprehension area. If someone's not having reading or language comprehension issues, then we don't want to train that because sometimes things can look funny and the brain just rewires around itself on its own. And then we don't want to mess with that, So we have, it's a long one. It's a 300 questionnaire, but it assesses all the different areas in their life. And then we compare their answers to that questionnaire with the EEG. And then based off of that, then we can determine the neurofeedback protocols that are best for someone.
Got it. So, yeah, it's a really great process to make sure that you are getting, like you said, kind of not messing with something where it's like, hey, the brain found a workaround. It's working. We can go ahead and let that be. We're looking for where someone is struggling, where it's making their day to day harder. And that's where you're wanting to hone in.
Right. And then just like another thing I would add is if someone is talking about being curious about neurofeedback, is I do try to be upfront with the time commitment that comes with it because we are rewiring the brain and it's going to take time and it's going to take repetition. So the standard industry is that you need to come in 2 times a week for the neurofeedback therapy. And then on average, I would say our clients do about 40 sessions. If it's a more like minor case, we could do 20. If it's a very intense case, I would say 60. But I would say you would need to commit to a 20 sessions and then someone can take a break because that can be a lot of time coming in. And then they'll often come back and do the next 20. For some clients, I can offer home training if they can qualify for that home training, but there's some requirements you have to fit for that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. And if someone's going, let's say twice a week, and then would they typically have, if we're talking about trauma specifically, one talk therapy session per week as well?
Yes, we would recommend one talk therapy session per week. And then what we do is every 20 sessions, we do we call it a mini EEG. It's the same process where they come in, we put the cap on them, we put the gel in, they sit still for 10 minutes, eyes open, and then 10 minutes, eyes closed, because your brain produces different waves whenever your eyes are closed. And we just don't do as many tests for that one of the 20 sessions. So it's cheaper too. But then that lets us know, has the brain changed? And then we can ask them, have you noticed improvements? And then that'll help us figure out where to go for the next 20 sessions.
Great. So for anyone who wants to look for their respective area to see, because of course this is an in-person, modality. So where is there like a general website where they can go and they can search by area code to see if there's someone certified?
Yes. So if you go to the BCIA, bcia.org, there's a little, what would you call link in their main menu header that says find practitioner and mentor. And then you can type in your zip code and it'll tell people, and that's how you can find a biofeedback therapist as well in your area. And that's, training your physiology. That's a really great way. I feel like, those people on that website can be really trusted, because whenever you are finding a neurofeedback practitioner, it is really important to look at what kind of equipment are they using, what kind of neurofeedback training are they using, and then what assessment tools are they using? Are they using EEG? Are they using brain maps? Here at the center, we do amplitude training. We've seen some systems out there that claim that they're doing neurofeedback, and they'll say that they have all this research behind them, but then really what they're just doing is they're using research from other neurofeedback devices and just kind of claiming it as their own. So it is important to do your research, but if you're on the BCIA, then you should find a good quality neurofeedback therapist.
Okay, great. And then I'm going to link absolutely to where you are in Houston. I'm going to have to get that from you. I know you've said the name of it, but in case anyone happens to, I know we have people who tune in from the Houston metro area. And so in case anyone happens to be more local to where you work out of, but also for anyone who wants to learn more about what they're doing with Desert Road Ministries, I got to go to their gala a couple months ago now, and the work they're doing, I just wholeheartedly support it. It is incredible, and I am praying that it grows, because the impact it can have, you ladies can have with the different modalities that you can offer. I think it's incredible, and it's so incredibly needed as well. So I also hope you venture outside of Houston in the future. So I have goals for y'all, but so super exciting.
Megan's moving to Brenham, so we're going to have a Brenham spot.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great. So yeah, we're going to link them too, so you guys can follow along, see what they're doing, see what they're up to. And again, if you happen to be local, please feel free to give them a follow and interact, because it's really good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.